There is a particular kind of exhaustion that nobody talks about. Not the exhaustion of working too hard, or sleeping too little or carrying too much. This is something quieter than that. It is the exhaustion of spending years, sometimes a lifetime, being read wrong. You pay attention to people, you notice things, you care, not as a performance of caring, but in that involuntary way where the reality of another person simply arrives before you have decided what to do with it. And somewhere along the way, the world looked at all of that and decided it was weakness. Maybe someone said it directly. Maybe it was the pattern, the way certain rooms shifted when you walked in, the way your honesty was treated as naivety, the way your openness was used against you, the way the people who moved through the world with the sharpest elbows always seemed to arrive first. And here is the part that is almost impossible to explain. You could not defend yourself, because the moment you tried to argue that your kindness was not stupidity, you sounded exactly like what they said you were. Naive, idealistic, unable to see how things really work. This is what we are going to examine. Not kindness as a virtue, not as something to protect or to be proud of, but kindness as a mode of perception, a specific way of seeing the world that the cynical field simply does not have the instruments to read. And what happens across centuries and traditions when that kind of perception walks into a room that has already decided what strength looks like? In 1961, a French philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas published a book called Totality and Infinity. It was not an easy book. It was not meant to be. But buried inside its most difficult pages was an observation that changes everything about how we understand kindness. Levinas argued that ethics is not a system we build after we have already established who we are. Not a set of rules, not a social contract, not a decision. Ethics, for Levinas, comes first, before reason, before strategy, before we have even decided what to do with another person. What triggers it is the face, not the face as physical feature, the face as the way another person's reality arrives before you have consented to receive it. Levinas wrote that the first word of the face is not spoken but commanded, and the command is simply, do not kill me. Do not reduce me. Do not make me into an object in your story. This happens before thought, before calculation, before you have assessed whether this person is useful or dangerous to you, above or below you, in any hierarchy that matters to your survival. And here is what Levinas understood that most people who write about kindness have not understood: the capacity to receive that command, to let the face of another arrive without immediately processing it through the lens of what it means for you, is not a choice. It is a structure of perception. Some people are built or formed or opened by experience into perceiving the world this way, and some are not. The difference between them is not a difference of character. It is a difference in how reality itself is organized before interpretation begins. This is the distinction that matters. Not kind people versus cruel people, not good versus evil, but two fundamentally different ways of processing the reality of another human being. In one mode, the other person is first encountered as a face, as a demand, as a universe, as something that exceeds any category you could place them in. In the other person is first processed as information, threat or ally, useful or not, above or below. This second mode is not necessarily cruel. It is organized around self-preservation, And it is the mode that most social systems reward, because it is efficient, because it calculates correctly, because it arrives first. What Levinas saw, and what matters for what we are examining in this video, is that these two modes of perception are not equally legible to each other. The field organized around self-preservation has instruments for reading everything that moves through it. Dominance, submission, strategy, performance, all readable because they operate within the same logic. But genuine encounter with the face of another, that involuntary attention, that presence before calculation, has no equivalent in the self-preservation field. It does not compute, and what does not compute in a system that depends on computation gets read as malfunction, not as strength that has chosen not to deploy itself, as absence of strength, as gap where strategy should be. This is the misreading, not a moral failure, not cruelty, though cruelty sometimes follows. A category error. The field is reading a phenomenon with instruments designed for something else entirely, and arriving at the only conclusion those instruments can produce: weakness. Carl Jung saw a version of this from a different angle. The persona, the mask constructed to navigate social reality, is built entirely from the logic of the self-preservation field. It calculates, it performs, it manages impressions. When someone appears to operate without a persona, or with a radically thin one, the people around them face a specific dissonance, not because the unmasked person is threatening them, but because the absence of a mask makes the mask visible. And the mask, once visible, is uncomfortable in a way that is very difficult to sit with. The solution the system finds, quickly, without deliberation, is to reframe the absence of a mask as its own kind of mask. If you are not calculating, you must be calculating better than they can see. If your kindness is not performance, it must be a performance sophisticated enough to be invisible. The alternative, that you simply are not performing, is structurally inadmissible. It would require too much revision, and a world built on finite, calculable exchange has never known what to do with someone who is not operating within those terms. It names them, and the name it reaches for, across centuries and cultures, is almost always the same. In 1868, Fyodor Dostoevsky sat down to write what he later called the most difficult project of his life. He wanted to create a truly beautiful person, not a saint in stained glass, not a moral lesson in human form, a person of genuine goodness, placed inside the real world and observed with complete honesty. The result was Prince Lev Nikolaevich Myshkin, and Dostoevsky already knew before he finished the first chapter that it would end in destruction. His surname comes from the Russian diminutive Mishka, little mouse, harmless, soft, out of place in rooms built for larger creatures. His given name, Lev, means lion. Dostoevsky chose both names deliberately. The character he was building was that exact paradox, something with the nature of a lion and the fate of a mouse, in a world that could only see the mouse. The novel opens with Myshkin returning to St. Petersburg after years in a Swiss sanatorium where he had been treated for epilepsy. He is 26 years old. He has almost no money, almost no experience of society, and almost no ability to navigate the social codes that everyone around him treats as basic literacy. Within hours of his arrival, the city begins testing him in ways he does not recognize as tests. What strikes every character he meets, and what strikes the reader, is not his naivety. It is his attention. Myshkin listens in a way that people do not expect to be listened to. He sees things in people's faces that those people have not shown anyone. He responds to what is actually happening in a room rather than to what is being performed. This is not a skill. It is not emotional intelligence deployed as strategy. It is simply that the layer of social performance through which most people interact with each other is, for him, nearly transparent. He sees through it without trying to. In any other kind of story, this would be a gift. In St. Petersburg, in a city of ambition, debt, and carefully maintained appearances, it is something closer to an affliction. Not because Myshkin is wrong about what he sees. He is almost never wrong. But because a person who sees through performance, in a world built on performance, becomes unbearable to be around. His presence makes the performance visible. And the performance, made visible, cannot continue in quite the same way. The people around him begin to feel exposed without knowing why. They begin to resent him without being able to name the cause. Dostoevsky had his own epilepsy. He knew the condition from inside, the aura before a seizure, that brief and terrible moment of clarity in which the world seems to open into something larger than ordinary perception can hold. He gave Myshkin that same aura, those seconds of absolute attention before the fall. And he made it into a way of being, not just a medical event. Myshkin lives, most of the time, in the state that Dostoevsky only visited in those moments before the seizure took him. This is not a coincidence. It is the center of what Dostoevsky was trying to show. The question the novel poses, and never answers cleanly, is this: what happens when a person who is constitutionally unable to operate within the logic of self-preservation enters a world that has organized every institution, every relationship, every social code around exactly that logic? Not what should happen, what actually happens. The answer Dostoevsky gives across 400 pages is both precise and devastating. Myshkin is loved, genuinely, intensely loved, by almost everyone who encounters him. And he is destroyed, not by enemies. He has almost none. He is destroyed by the structural incompatibility between what he is and what the world he inhabits requires its inhabitants to be. He cannot protect himself, not because he lacks intelligence. He is often the most perceptive person in the room, but because protection requires a certain willingness to treat other people as objects of strategy. And that move is simply not available to him. The face of the other arrives before strategy can form. Levinas would have recognized him immediately. Dostoevsky loved Myshkin. He said so. And he gave him the only ending that honesty allowed. Now consider this. Dostoevsky published the book, the world read it. And the title they saw, the word that the novel's society uses for a person of this kind of perception, for someone whose attention to the face of the other is so complete that performance cannot survive near him, was not saint. It was not visionary. It was idiot. The word idiot has a history worth knowing. In ancient Greek, idiots, from which it derives, did not mean someone of low intelligence. It meant a private person, someone who lived outside public life, who did not participate in the political and civic structures that organized the city. The idiot was not stupid. He was simply not playing the game that everyone else had agreed was the only game worth playing. The language shifted. The word calcified into its modern meaning. But the original sense is still there, underneath if you look. The idiot, in the classical world, was not a deficiency. He was an absence from a particular field of performance. And what is Myshkin? Exactly, if not that. A person not deficient in intelligence, but absent from the game. Present instead in something the game has no name for. This pattern, the misreading of a different mode of perception as a lack, has a longer history than Dostoevsky. It runs through the oldest texts we have. In the 5th chapter of Matthew, there is a line that has been translated, mistranslated, sentimentalized, and drained of its original force for roughly 2,000 years. Blessed are the meek, the text says in English, and the word meek has done enormous damage to what was actually written. The Greek is praus, pronounced praus. And praus does not mean meek in the sense the English word carries. Soft, yielding, without force, easily dismissed. In classical Greek, praus was a technical term. It was used specifically to describe a war horse that had been trained, not broken, not diminished, a horse that carried within it the full capacity for violence, speed, and power, and had learned to hold that force under the discipline of the rider, to deploy it only when the situation genuinely required. Praus was strength organized into something more precise than raw force, more controlled, and therefore more dangerous than the force that simply erupts. The theologians who worked with this text in the early centuries knew this. They were reading Greek. They understood that the word, the condition, that Dostoevsky would eventually reach for when he built Myshkin was already present in Matthew. Not meekness as absence of power. Meekness as power that has chosen a different relationship to its own force. The lion who moves through the world like a mouse, not because the lion has forgotten what it is, but because the lion has learned something the mouse never needed to learn. Blessed are those whose strength is held under that kind of control. That is what the text says, in the language it was written in. It was translated into softness. And once the translation hardened into tradition, 2,000 years of interpretation built on top of it, meekness became something to be pitied or condescended to, something that patient people simply had to endure until the afterlife corrected the record. The Sermon on the Mount became consolation for those who had lost, rather than a precise description of a specific mode of being that the winning field simply cannot read. But the original word had nothing to apologize for. Praus was not a condition of diminishment. It was a description of a very specific and very difficult relationship between power and restraint, one that required, if anything, more internal organization than the straightforward deployment of force ever does. What connects this directly to Levinas and to Myshkin is the following. The praus figure is systematically misread by those around him for exactly the same reason. The strength is not being performed. It is not announcing itself. It is not converting itself into the signals that the surrounding social field uses to identify strength. And so the field, running its standard instruments, finds nothing it recognizes as power, and concludes that no power is present. The category error is structural, not a failure of observation. The field is observing correctly by its own instruments. It simply has no instrument calibrated for the particular thing it is looking at. This is not only a philosophical problem. It has consequences, real ones, measured in the lives of people who carry this mode of perception through a world that developed none of its institutions to accommodate them. We are about to look at one tradition that found, over centuries, a very particular response to exactly this problem. Not a solution. A response. One that is stranger than anything Dostoevsky imagined, and older than the word idiot itself. Sometime in the 6th century, a monk named Simeon left the monastery where he had lived for decades, walked into the city of Emesa in what is now Syria, and began to behave in ways that made no sense to anyone around him. He dragged a dead dog through the streets. He ate meat on Good Friday in front of the congregation. He overturned the tables of food sellers in the market. He tripped people who were walking. He entered the women's section of the baths. He was beaten repeatedly, mocked consistently, and considered by most people who encountered him to be simply and obviously mad. He was not mad. He knew exactly what he was doing. Simeon had, by the account of his contemporaries, already reached a state of spiritual development that the tradition around him considered the highest available to a human being. He had nothing left to prove, nothing left to protect, and nothing left to perform. And he had made a specific decision that rather than live in the monastery, receiving the deference and admiration that genuine holiness attracted, he would go into the city and conceal everything he was behind, a performance of incompetence so thorough that no one would ever mistake him for someone worth admiring. He would speak truth to people who needed to hear it, precisely because no one takes the madman seriously enough to silence him. He would act with complete freedom, precisely because no one constrains a person they have already dismissed. He would be, in the language the tradition would eventually develop for this practice, a fool for Christ. The Russian word for this figure is yurodivyi. Yurodivyi. It names a specific category of Orthodox saint, a specific mode of ascetic practice that the Eastern Church canonized into its hagiography. 36 of them appear in the Russian Orthodox calendar. Basil the Blessed, who gave his name to the cathedral on Red Square, was one. Xenia of St. Petersburg, who after her husband's death put on his clothes and insisted she was him, refusing her own identity entirely, was another. What all of them share is this: a deliberate, conscious, strategic performance of the very misreading we have been examining. The yurodivyi did not stumble into looking foolish. He chose it. She chose it. With full knowledge of what was being sacrificed: reputation, comfort, the basic social recognition that every human being requires to move through the world. They performed incompetence as an act of radical freedom. They took the category error the world applied to people of genuine perception and turned it into armor. Because here is what the tradition understood, practically and with considerable sophistication. The person whom society has classified as a fool cannot be effectively controlled by the mechanisms that control everyone else. You cannot threaten status that has been voluntarily abandoned. You cannot shame someone who has already accepted public humiliation as the price of their practice. You cannot silence the madman because the madman has already placed himself outside the conversational space where silencing operates. Peter the Great hated the yurodivyi with a specificity that tells you everything. He called them lazy beggars consuming Russia's labor. He tried to suppress the tradition through legislation. He failed. Because you cannot legislate against a person who has already given up the things legislation threatens you with. The yurodivyi and Myshkin are related figures, but the relationship is an inversion. Myshkin cannot perform the social field. The yurodivyi will not. One arrives at the misreading involuntarily through the structure of his perception. The other manufactures the misreading deliberately, as an act of spiritual will, but both end up in the same place, outside the field's instruments of control, visible to it only as absence, as malfunction, as the word the field reaches for when it cannot categorize what it is seeing. What the tradition of the yurodivyi adds to what Levinas and Dostoevsky give us is this. The misreading was so consistent, so structural, so predictable across centuries that an entire spiritual practice was built around it. People looked at the pattern, the way genuine perception is read as deficiency, the way praus is read as weakness, and decided to weaponize it. That is not the response of people who believed the world was wrong to misread them. That is the response of people who had accepted, with complete clarity, that the world would never stop. There is a version of everything we have examined so far that turns it into something comfortable. The misreading is the world's failure, not yours. The praus figure carries hidden strength. The yurodivyi transforms persecution into freedom. Myshkin is destroyed, yes, but he is also the most beloved figure in the novel. There is a way of receiving all of this that leaves you feeling clarified, perhaps even vindicated, and essentially untouched. That is not what we are doing here, because there is something that the philosophical frameworks do not fully account for, and that the spiritual traditions tend to aestheticize, and that Dostoevsky, to his considerable credit, did not look away from: the cost. Not the abstract cost. The specific, accumulated, daily cost of moving through a world that has no instrument for reading what you are, and that will therefore, consistently and without malice, treat the most essential thing about you as a deficiency. Marie-Louise von Franz, the Swiss psychoanalyst who spent decades working with Carl Jung and then extending his ideas in directions he had not taken them, wrote extensively about the figure she called the puer aeternus, the eternal child. The term comes from Ovid, and in Jungian psychology, it describes a particular psychological structure, someone who carries the qualities of openness, imagination, and radical presence to experience that belong, in the developmental scheme, to youth, and carries them past the point where the world expects them to be exchanged for something more defended. Von Franz was not sentimental about this figure. She saw clearly what the puer carries, and she saw equally clearly what the carrying costs. The world is not organized around openness. It is organized around what she would have called the senex, the principle of structure, consolidation, protection, strategy. The social institutions that human beings build to survive collectively are senex institutions. They reward the person who can delay, calculate, protect, and accumulate. They have no mechanism for honoring the person who arrives at every encounter fully open, without the layer of defended self-interest that the institution treats as basic equipment. And so the person who carries this mode of perception, involuntarily, the way Myshkin carries it, not as a spiritual practice but as the simple structure of how they encounter the world, pays a price that compounds over time, not always dramatically, more often quietly, in the accumulated weight of being misread, in the particular exhaustion of having your attention treated as naivety, your presence treated as vulnerability, your inability to strategize treated as an inability to see, in the relationships that extract from you without understanding what is being extracted, In the moments when you realize that the person you were most open to has been reading your openness as an invitation to take more than you intended to give. Dostoevsky did not spare Myshkin this. The novel does not end with Myshkin transcendent, vindicated, understood. It ends with him returned to the sanatorium, his mind gone. The relationships he entered with such complete attention collapsed around him, the people who loved him unable to protect him from the structural consequence of what he was. Von Franz would have said, "The puer must eventually encounter the weight of matter, must learn what it costs to be fully present in a world built for people who are not." That encounter is rarely gentle, and the question of what survives it, whether the openness survives or is exchanged for a defended self that can finally navigate without constant injury, that question does not have a clean answer. What we can say is this: the cost is real. The exhaustion is real. The accumulated misreadings are real in their effects, regardless of whether the misreading is the observer's failure rather than yours. Understanding the mechanism does not dissolve it. Knowing that praus was mistranslated does not give you back the years spent moving through a world that was reading the mistranslation. And this is where the question changes, because we have been asking, so far, what kindness is, how it works, why it is misread, what the traditions say about it. But there is a different question underneath that one. And it is the question that Dostoevsky and Levinas and the yurodivyi tradition and von Franz in her most honest moments all arrive at eventually. Not what is this, but what does it ask of the person who carries it? What does it ask of the person who carries it? That question has no single answer, but the traditions we have examined, Levinas, Dostoevsky, the yurodivyi, von Franz, do converge on something, not a solution, a recognition. The person who perceives the world through the face of the other, who cannot easily convert other people into instruments of strategy, who carries the praus structure of strength held rather than deployed. This person is not living a diminished version of the life that the self-preservation field lives. They are living a different life entirely, with different costs, different textures, different forms of loss, and a different relationship to what the word strength actually means. The yurodivyi understood this with unusual clarity. The practice they built was not a practice of making the misreading stop. It was a practice of what to do once you have accepted, fully and without remainder, that it will not. The question they were answering was not, how do I make the world see me correctly? It was, given that it will not, given that the instruments available to the surrounding field are genuinely not calibrated for what I am. How do I live without being destroyed by that? Simeon of Emesa walked into the city not because he thought the city would eventually understand him. He walked in because he had found a way to remain fully himself inside the city's complete misunderstanding of him. That is a very different thing from acceptance in the modern therapeutic sense. It is not resignation. It is something closer to what Dostoevsky was reaching for with Myshkin, except that Simeon survived it because he had chosen it, and Myshkin did not because it had been chosen for him. Von Franz saw the puer's encounter with the weight of matter as a confrontation that could not be avoided. But she also saw, and this is the part that tends to be underemphasized, that the integration she was describing was not the death of the puer's qualities, It was not the exchange of openness for defense, of presence for strategy. It was the acquisition of enough groundedness to carry those qualities without being destroyed by their incompatibility with the surrounding field. The puer who survives the encounter is not a former puer. They are something the tradition has no clean name for. Someone who has kept what they are and learned to hold it without being held down by it. This is not a map. It does not tell you where to walk, but it is, at minimum, a description of what the terrain actually is, which is more than most of what is written about kindness and weakness manages to offer. If you have stayed with this video to this point, I want to say something directly. This channel exists for exactly this kind of thinking, not the kind that makes you feel better, but the kind that makes the structure of things clearer, which is a different gift, and in the long run, a more durable one. If that is what you are looking for, subscribe. And leave a comment with one word that describes how the world has most consistently misread you. I am genuinely curious, and those answers will shape what this channel explores next. Now, there is one more thing to say before we close. We have described the misreading, traced it across philosophy, literature, theology, and depth psychology, named the cost without looking away from it. But there is a question sitting underneath all of this that none of our sources answer directly. The self-preservation field, the world organized around calculation, strategy, and the persona, is extraordinarily effective at what it does. It builds institutions. It accumulates power. It survives. By every metric it uses to measure itself, it wins. And the person who cannot or will not operate within it, who sees the face before the strategy, who holds strength rather than performing it, who moves through the world the way Myshkin moved through St. Petersburg. What do they build? What do they leave behind? What is the argument, if there is one, that this mode of perception is not simply a disadvantage that certain people must carry, but something the world actually requires, in a way it has not yet found language to ask for? That is the question the final movement of this video will sit with, not answer, sit with. Because the most honest thing any of these traditions offer is not a resolution. It is a reframing of what the question actually is. And sometimes that is the only movement available. And sometimes it is enough. There is a detail in The Idiot that most summaries of the novel omit. In the moments before his epileptic seizures, in that brief window of altered perception that Dostoevsky knew from his own body, Myshkin experiences something he cannot afterwards translate into language. He describes it haltingly as a feeling of extraordinary clarity, of everything making sense in a way it does not ordinarily make sense, of the world becoming for a few seconds completely legible. And then the seizure takes him, and when he returns, the clarity is gone. He is left with the memory of having understood something that he cannot now say. Dostoevsky never tells us what Myshkin understood in those moments. He was too honest a writer to invent it. But he circles it throughout the novel, in the way Myshkin moves through rooms, attending to things no one else attends to, responding to what is actually present rather than to what is being performed, treating each person he encounters as though their reality is the most important thing in the room. What the world read as idiocy was, in those moments of clarity, something else. A mode of perception that the ordinary social field runs too fast and too defended to access. not superior to the field. It could not survive in the field, but oriented towards something the field is not oriented toward. Levinas called it the face. The yurodivyi built a life around protecting their access to it. Von Franz saw it in the puer before the weight of matter arrived. The tradition that produced the Sermon on the Mount found a word for it in praus, and watched that word be slowly translated into something that sounded like losing. The self-preservation field wins. That is simply true. It accumulates, it endures, it builds the institutions that outlast any individual life. And the person who cannot operate within it pays a price that is real and does not become less real because we have named the mechanism correctly. But here is what the self-preservation field cannot do. It cannot see the face, not because it lacks intelligence. It is often extraordinarily intelligent, but because the face, in Levinas's sense, only becomes visible when you stop processing the other person as information. And the field cannot stop. It is built not to stop. The moment it stops, it is no longer the field. What Myshkin could do, what the yurodivyi practiced, what Praus describes, what Levinas was pointing toward, was stop, fully, in the presence of another person, and receive what was there before strategy formed. That capacity does not build institutions. It does not accumulate. It does not leave monuments. What it leaves is harder to locate and harder to measure. It leaves the moment when someone felt, perhaps for the first time, that they had been seen, not assessed, not categorized, not responded to strategically. Seen. The way Myshkin saw Nastasia Filipovna in the opening of the novel, understood her with a precision that took her breath away, not because he was performing understanding, but because he simply was not doing anything else. The world called him an idiot for it. The world was, by its own instruments, correct. But Nastasia Filipovna carried that moment through everything that followed, through every subsequent cruelty, every wound, every manipulation. She carried the memory of having been seen by someone who wanted nothing from her seeing. That is not nothing. It may not be enough. It was not enough to save her or him. Dostoevsky did not lie about that, but it is not nothing. And perhaps that is where we have to leave this. Not with a resolution, not with the argument that kindness wins, or that the meek inherit anything in the time frame any of us can observe, but with the possibility that what the world cannot measure is not therefore without weight, that what the self-preservation field cannot see is not therefore absent. The face is there. It was there before strategy. It will be there after. And somewhere in the accumulated moments when someone stopped long enough to receive it, something passes between people that the field has no instrument to detect. Whether that matters is a question each person who carries this mode of perception must answer for themselves, in the terms available to them, with the life that is theirs to live. Dostoevsky gave Myshkin the aura before the fall, that brief, inarticulate clarity, and refused to tell us what it contained, perhaps because the only honest answer is that it cannot be contained, only experienced, and then carried, imperfectly, into the rooms we enter, as ourselves. However the room decides to read that, this channel is called Myth and Mirror. The myth is the structure, the pattern that recurs across traditions, centuries, languages and civilizations beneath the surface of what we think we already understand. The mirror is the moment when that pattern turns toward you, and something in it is recognizable. not as information, as your own life. That is what we do here. We take the symbolic structures that the ancient world encoded in its literature, its theology, its philosophy, its hagiography, and we hold them up until the contemporary reflection becomes visible. Until what Dostoevsky was doing in 1868 and what Levinas was doing in 1961 and what an Orthodox monk was doing in 6th century Syria become legible as different angles on the same question. The one you came in with, the one that brought you here. We will keep making videos like this one. Long ones, careful ones. Videos that do not resolve what cannot honestly be resolved, and do not offer comfort where comfort would be a form of dishonesty. If you found something here worth returning to, subscribe. Share this with one person who you think will understand why you sent it without you having to explain. And leave the word, one word in the comments, how the world has most consistently read you. We will be back.